For most people, we love getting new camera gear, and for a beginner, becoming comfortable using manual mode with any camera can be a scary thing to try, and for most people, they simply don't. They take their new camera out of the box, charge it, take a photo, and instead of it being properly exposed, it looks like dog shit. So they put the camera back in the closet and never be seen again. Sound familiar? We all start somewhere, and I hope this is a good place to start in getting you to take better photos. Hey guys, today we are talking about how to properly expose your photos using manual mode. Now, before you go, this isn't that scary, and I'm going to show you why. So this video will give you the building blocks to hopefully feel more comfortable and confident behind the camera using manual mode, and hopefully by the end of this video, you'll be able to go grab your camera and know that you're going to go nail some photos. So let's get into it. So let's jump straight into it. So to properly expose your photos, you need to understand three key concepts: shutter speed, aperture or f-stop, and your ISO. All three of those concepts that we just spoke about link hand in hand in creating that perfect image. So let's begin with shutter speed. Okay, so to me and hopefully a lot of other photographers, shutter speed is the most used function on their camera. It certainly is for me. Let me show you why. But first, let's look at the actual definition. Shutter speed or exposure time is the length of time that the film or digital sensor inside the camera is exposed to light when taking a photograph. Okay, now that that is out of the way, hopefully that gives you a very brief understanding of what shutter speed can do and how it links to letting light in. So now what we're going to do is look at different ways we can control exposure and capture different photos by just changing the shutter speed. Now, depending on the time of day that you are shooting, whether it's broad daylight, nighttime, or golden hour, all these factors will come into play when you are deciding what shutter speed to use. Okay, so let's begin with a fast shutter speed. So now when you're going to be using that is most likely in extremely broad daylight, or when you're trying to capture fast moving sports like cricket, soccer, AFL, anything like that. So these conditions are probably the worst to shoot in. Everything is super bright and just yuck, really. But if you have to shoot during these conditions, I'm going to walk you through the settings to help you nail these photos in poor conditions. So we have my dog here who is going to be our model. So these principles will work alongside if you're doing something like a portrait session. So I'll put on the GoPro and talk you through those settings. So what I'm doing here, I've just kept my shutter speed at 25 hundredths of a second just to try keep her in like focus and no motion blur on her face. ISO 100 to keep the image nice and sharp. Okay, so now we are going to be looking at the darker side of photography. No, not the evil side, just the nighttime side. So what you're going to need to do, most likely in this situation, is slow down your shutter speed to let all that light in and hopefully capture a banger. Okay, so looking at these two photos where we had a shutter speed quick enough just to expose the photo, and then we had a shutter speed that's long enough to bring into motion blur, which looks really cool and I'm super happy with it. So you can see how changing the shutter speed has such a dramatic effect on these two photos, where we had one photo perfectly exposing the photo, and then the second one we let open for a bit longer to allow for that motion blur to come in. So I hope you can see how we use that and utilize that feature on your camera. So let's move on. Okay, so our next thing we are going to talk about is our aperture or f-stop. Now, first things first, your shutter speed and your aperture work hand in hand. You need one to work with the other, otherwise your photo will look like shit. So let's discuss why. So the way that aperture controls light is very simple. The lower the f-stop, the more light gets let in. The higher the f-stop, the less light gets in. So just remember that, so it's opposite. That makes sense? Lower, higher, higher, lower. Cool. Okay, so now another feature that's really cool is that f-stop can control your depth of field, or bokeh, as what photographers like to call it. Now, what that does is if you're, for example, shooting a portrait session, you want your f-stop to be low. Now, what's that going to do? Your subject's going to be in focus and then your background's going to be blurred. So if I just put my hand here, you can see everything is focused in my hand, everything around is blurred. So that's sort of the concept there. Just a really quick example. And then if you go to a higher f-stop, obviously it's going to be the opposite. So higher f-stop, everything's going to be in focus. So when you mainly use this is for your landscapes. So you don't want just one part of your landscape in focus because it's going to look awful, right? Well, not awful, but not as good. So you want everything to be in focus. So you want your aperture high around f16 and above. And yeah, so what does that mean? Your aperture is going to be high. Your shutter speed is going to have to be low to let more light in, since your aperture is not letting a lot of light in. Does that make sense? I hope it does. Okay, so what I am doing now, I am just going to show you what low aperture and a high aperture looks like on a subject. So hopefully you can see I've got a toy R34 GTR and a TV in the background over there. So this will be the easiest way to show you how you can create that bokeh effect for your portrait photos and then your landscape photos with everything's in focus. So I'm gonna just continue to get set up. That was easy. Okay, so first things first, we're gonna do a low aperture. So we're gonna get our GTR all in focus and then our TV will be blurred and yeah. So yet again, so since our aperture is low, it's going to let more light in. So our shutter is pretty dark in my room. I don't know if you can see me, but so since there's not a lot of light in, we are going to set our shutter speed to 30th of a second, f1.8 because that's the lowest my lens can go to, and then ISO 100 to keep it nice and sharp. So let's take a photo and see how it looks. So all the photos will come up on the screen as I click them. Like you can see how GTR is so in focus and then TV is nice and bokeh out. Now if we go all the way up to f22, which is the highest I can go, our shutter speed will have to be around 10 seconds. This yet again because higher the number, the less light. So you have to balance it out with the shutter speed. And then, so while that's busy taking the photo, so as soon as this takes the image, you'll see TV is in focus as well as the car. So yet again, for landscapes, this is perfect. Just took the photo then, and you can see that, you can see the background as well. I hope that makes sense. Let's move on to ISO. Okay, so now ISO refers to your camera's sensitivity to light. That's pretty much the only explanation, and it is displayed on your camera as 100, 200, 300, 400, and so on. Pretty simple, right? Now, what this does to your photos is also really simple. So the lower your ISO, the less sensitive it is to light. So again, it's going to be darker, but however, your image will be super clean. There's not going to be a whole lot of grain and noise and just shit in your photo. And then the higher you turn your ISO up, obviously it's going to be more light let into your sensor. Not let in, but more sensitive to light. So your image will be brighter, and then once you expose it properly with your shutter speed and your aperture, once it's nicely exposed, and then it's going to have a lot of noise and grain and shit you don't want in there. So I hope that makes sense. I guess it should, hopefully. Okay, so for this first image, our settings will be set at 15th of a second, f1.8, and ISO 100. So as soon as this photo takes, it will come up on the screen, and then you'll see that it is super sharp, and super clean. So let's do that. I don't think it's in focus. Cool. So you won't see a whole lot of noise or grain on there. So now if we go to, what are we gonna do? ISO, you can already see on the screen there that it is really overexposed. So let's do 25/600. Now, as you can see, it's overexposed, so you have to balance it out with your Shutter speed, so let's go to 32 hundredths of a second. So let's take a photo and see how it looks. Hopefully it is grainy, otherwise I will be wrong. Yeah, so if you zoom in like that, you can see, I'll zoom in on the video, but yeah, super grainy, looks like shit compared to the ISO 100, and yeah, that's everything to do with ISO. Okay, so after all that, I hope you can understand how those three key concepts, again, shutter speed, ISO, and your f-stop or aperture, all links together in exposing a photo correctly and in the best way you can to get your perfect photo. Now, I hope you guys have enjoyed this video and hopefully learned something to take away for you guys to go home and practice. If you have, I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.